let me introduce Mary Jane to you. So she's here for at least 4 weeks. I'm trying to twist her arm to stay a little longer. We'll see how that works. She is a professor and chair of religion at Wesleyan University. And she's also core faculty in feminist gender and sexuality studies, and she has an affiliated appointment in Science and Society program. And she's very interested in the interface between philosophy, science, religion. And I got to know her because I was asked to review one of her books, which is the one on the multiverse for Columbia University Press. And I thought, wow, this is fabulous. And obviously she got a very good book out. And then when I got the grant, she was one of the first people I thought about that would fit so well this role of really bridging between the different aspects of academia, right? Today, she's going to talk to us about pantheism. Essentially, it's some aspects of pantheism that I don't know, but apparently pantheism has been kind of despised by philosophers since Spinoza and on, after Spinoza and on, and she's going to tell us why that's the case. So Mary Jane, please. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to change everything now. Let's see if this is the best. Is that? And by the way, that trail was produced by that young man over there. Everything we do is here at Dartmouth.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. Thank you for that kind introduction, for the exciting trek through ICE's activities, and above all, for bringing me to Dartmouth to be a fellow of the Institute. I've been so excited to learn about the college and the wider community, and I look forward to getting to know more of you during my visit in the coming weeks. Thanks also to Amy Flockton for her expert and extraordinarily kind management of my visit and of this talk. And finally, I am delighted to be able to thank Mrs. Margie Hughes, a member of the Hanover community, who taught me 6th grade English a million years ago in Rumson, New Jersey. It is largely thanks to her that I'm able to write anything at all, and I couldn't be more grateful. I should clarify, of course, that while Mrs. Hughes is in some indirect way responsible for the form of what follows, she is in no way responsible for its admittedly bizarre content. How are we doing with the lights? Which scene do you want? One? Yeah? Of course. Hi. Part 1. In 1697, the French philosopher Pierre Bayle published his historical and critical dictionary, an eclectic, rambling compendium whose footnotes comically outweigh its main text, and whose essays illuminate the lives and works of biblical figures, monarchs, a couple of Asian empires, and an exceedingly strange smattering of philosophers. Known for its thoroughgoing skepticism, its lewd anecdotes, moral musings, and defense of religious and political tolerance, Bayle's dictionary quickly became the philosophical bestseller of the 18th century, influencing every classic Enlightenment thinker from Diderot and Voltaire to Berkeley and Hume to Jefferson and Melville. Throughout the entries, Bayle's tone is strident and uncompromising. He seeks to undermine nearly every position that he considers, following them Socratically and with a heavy dose of crankiness until they collapse under their own weight. Even for the acclimated reader, however, it can be unsettling, 4 volumes in, to stumble upon what one can in all fairness call Pierre Bayle's unmeasured screed against Baruch Spinoza. Calling Spinoza a Jew by birth and afterwards a deserter from Judaism and lastly an atheist, Bayle does not even take time to explain the arguments he clearly despises. As far as he is concerned, even the most cursory glance by the dullest of humans will reveal that Spinoza's philosophy surpasses all the monstrosities and chimerical disorders of the craziest people who were ever put away in lunatic asylums. What is this surpassing monstrosity, this chimerical lunacy? Bayle only says it once, as if dwelling on it any longer might make it contagious. Hiding it in a footnote in a subordinate clause, he mentions in passing that the insanity at hand is Spinoza's identification of thought and extension. Thought and extension, often colloquialized as mind and body, were for the earlier philosopher René Descartes two distinct substances, meaning each of them was self-sufficient, inhering in no greater thing. Against Descartes, Spinoza insisted that mind and body were merely two attributes of the same substance, which he called God, or nature. So here's our monstrosity. According to Spinoza, God and nature are the same thing. As he hastily mentions in his theological political treatise, the power of nature is the divine power and virtue, and the divine power is the very essence of God. But I prefer to pass this by for the present. Now, if we don't let him pass it by, and linger for a moment with the mathematics of this passing phrase, we will see that if the power of nature is the divine power, and if the divine power is the essence of God, then by the transitive principle, the power of nature is the very essence of God. The universe we are in, and which in turn is in us, is what we mean when we say the word God. Unexpected? Perhaps. Unorthodox? Yes. Heretical even. But why does Bayle keep calling it monstrous? In a lecture on abnormality, Michel Foucault explains, the monster is essentially a mixture. It's a mixture of two realms, the animal and the human, of two species, of two individuals, of two sexes, of life and death. Finally, it is a mixture of forms, the transgression of natural limits, the transgression of classifications, of the table, and of the law as table. This is actually what is involved in monstrosity. So monsters mix things that ought to be opposed, like this fellow here, a manticore, with the body of a lion and the head of a human. In other renditions, manticores also have the tail of a scorpion and the wings of a bat. So monsters are mixtures. Now, what Foucault means by the table and the law as table is the whole chart of opposites that Aristotle ascribes to Pythagoras and that Western philosophy keeps extending and expanding, namely that table that opposes mind to body, human to animal, male to female, the unchanging to the changing, the rational to the irrational, the spiritual to the material, perfection to imperfection, light to darkness. We could honestly go on like this for days, piling on oppositions and adding characteristics to each of the two teams of Western metaphysics, which is to say, team good on the left and team not so good on the right. And as we might notice, the first of these terms includes all the characteristics we associate with God, while the second includes the characteristics we associate with the world, or creation, or nature. God is anthropomorphic, unchanging, masculine, and all the rest, while the world is animal, vegetal, changeable, irrational, and feminine. When Spinoza tells us that God is the world, then, he's mixing up traits that any sane philosophy would keep separate. How on earth could divinity be material? After all, as Bayle reminds us, matter is the vilest of all beings, the theater of all sorts of changes, the battleground of contrary charges, the subject of all corruptions and all generations. In a word, the being whose nature is most incompatible with the immutability of God. By mixing the spiritual and the material, the creator and the created, or God and nature, Spinoza therefore gives us not just any old monstrous hypothesis, but for Bayle, the most monstrous hypothesis that could be imagined, the most absurd, and the most diametrically opposed to the most evident notions of our mind. Again, Bayle tends to be a cantankerous writer, but his essay on Spinoza is a particularly egregious compendium of unsubstantiated name-calling. In addition to the repeated charges of monstrosity, Bayle dubs Spinoza's teachings absurd, horrible, and vile, his ethics an execrable abomination, his metaphysics poppycock, and his theological political treatise a pernicious and detestable book. And such insults are hardly limited to Bayle. One of Spinoza's contemporaries infamously wrote that his treatise had been forged in hell by a renegade Jew and the devil. And the source of this abomination, the professed identity of God and nature, is the position that yet another anti-Spinozist will in just a few years' time derisively named pantheism. Etymologically, pantheism names the identification of pan, or all, with theos, or God. But from there, the terms mean wildly different things depending on how you define the all. We hit another definitional roadblock when we realize that pantheism is more often a polemical term than one of positive identification. Put simply, there are more people saying, "You're a pantheist and that's absurd," than "My doctrine is pantheist and this is what that means." Casually, the term pantheism tends to connote personal or communal reverence for nature, that amorphous terrain overseen in Greek mythology by the goat god Pan, a monstrous mixture of divinity, animality, and humanity. Literarily, pantheism erupts throughout Renaissance pastoral and romantic poetry, often in the form of the goat god himself. There he is, who arrives on the scene to play the pipes, lounge with shepherds, dance in caves, chase nymphs, and generally put the pan in pansexual. Philosophically, however, pantheism remains little more than a limit case, the position nearly everyone wants to avoid, regardless of theoretical orientation. Even contemporary commentators on Spinoza, if they like him, will say he wasn't really a pantheist. So for atheists, theists, rationalists, empiricists, and idealists alike, pantheism has been from the beginning the school to which one simply does not adhere. In fact, it's so universally maligned that pantheism isn't even a school at all, or even a halfway decent concept. It's just a nasty name to call someone whose position a philosopher hates. But why? What's the matter with pantheism? To begin, it might help to address this particular question with its obverse, namely, why does the position in question keep arising such that it needs to be so repeatedly denounced? The very frequency and tenor of anti-pantheist proclamations suggests that there might be something alluring about this abominable position. In short, there would be no need to reject it so constantly and so irritably if it weren't so strangely compelling. In the mid-19th century, for example, a slew of treatises were written to combat the raging pantheism allegedly devouring the American literary landscape. And each of these treatises exhibits a kind of revolted fascination with the heresy in question. One particularly vilifying tract is the work of Nathaniel Smith Richardson, an Anglican divine in transcendentalist New England that's just starting to catch the fervor of spiritualism. Over the course of a lively and panicked defense of Christian orthodoxy, Richardson calls pantheism a misguided, dangerous, anti-intellectual, and even appalling movement. At the same time, Richardson concedes that he can see why pantheism has swept up the young and unchurched. There's a generosity about it, he admits, and a kindliness that's captivating. The generosity of pantheism, of course, is its attribution of godliness to all things, its coloring the whole world divine as if it bore in its hand the wand of an enchanter. It is a gorgeous vision, and no wonder that souls craving for rest and finding none should gladly yield themselves to its bewitching power. Note the feminized and sexualized language with which this enchanting, bewitching, gorgeous power is rendered. This metaphoric register courses throughout this whole anti-pantheist genre. Thus, the Reverend Morgan Dix of Trinity Church Manhattan warns that men lacking in sufficient education may have been tempted, seduced, tainted, poisoned by pantheism unawares. Similarly, Alexis de Tocqueville fears that pantheism ranks among those philosophies most likely to entice the human mind in democratic ages, and Herman Melville's Ishmael confesses, while meditating on the mysterious divine Pacific, that lifted by these eternal swells, you needs must own the seductive God, bowing your head to Pan. Melville himself evidently struggled with such revolting seductions. Writing to Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, Melville meditates on Goethe's infamous injunction to live in the all. "What nonsense," Melville writes. "Here is a fellow with a raging toothache. 'My dear boy,' Goethe says to him, 'you are sorely afflicted with that's wrong, but you must live in the all, and then you will be happy.' There is an immense deal of flummery in Goethe, says Melville, before going on admittedly to admit that there is also, in proportion to my own contact with him, a monstrous deal of it in me. And there's that word again. If what is monstrous about pantheism is its mixture of opposites, then it is perhaps unsurprising to find it provoke an affectively monstrous response, a mixture of attraction and repulsion, of loathing and longing, of I hate this thing, but I can't seem to think about anything else. Part 2. In her feminist decoding of Plato's cave, Luce Irigaray reminds us of the raging ambivalence that Western philosophy, like the Freudian subject, sustains toward its feminized origins. Like the Oedipal child, the Western tradition aims to make its way from the dark maternal womb space to the father's blinding light, from paganism to monotheism, from the cave to the sky, from the dirt to the ideas. The mother, along with the wife who stands in for her, thus becomes a complex site of disgust and desire, of repudiation and nostalgia, as the Oedipal man, like the whole phallocentric order, simultaneously commands and rejects everything associated with her. A testimony to the steady reduplication of this violent ambivalence, we find a similar structure in the logic of Orientalism, in which Western scholars and colonial officials both glorify and vilify a simultaneously seductive and repulsive East, which is rendered, as Edward Said has shown, in consistently dark, primitive, and feminine terms. And indeed, something of the dark, primitive, and feminine fuels the revoltingly attractive power of pantheism. Take, for example, Reverend Richardson's above-mentioned treatise, which begins by proclaiming pantheism is the child of the mysterious East. As evidence, Richardson imagines a nameless Indian sage in some dim and fragrant grove or silent mountain cavern from which he dreams up the absurd idea that even dark and earth-born masses are suffused with the divine expression of the one animating spirit. Thanks to its radical egalitarianism, Richardson admits, pantheism is a captivating philosophy. The problem is that it threatens to keep captivating, advancing its appalling movement, there's the ambivalence, to such an extent that pantheism in Europe and the West is destined to become the correlative of Buddhism in the East. Such widespread pantheist seduction, Richardson insists, can only be counteracted by a straightforward proclamation of Christian orthodoxy. Above all things, he writes, let there be a plain, distinct, and dogmatic teaching of the incarnation of the eternal Word. This is a reference, of course, to the appearance of God in human form in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. What Richardson is suggesting is that the incarnation will invalidate pantheism once and for all by insisting that God came into the world as one man, not all of humanity, and far less as the whole animal, vegetable, mineral world. What panics Richardson about the advance of pantheism is not, however, the simple demise of Christendom. Rather, what he seems to fear above all is a kind of collective, racialized unmanning. Pantheism, he predicts, will continue to seduce rosy, Western-born men into pseudo-Buddhist inertia until they become like the earth-born Indian sage who allegedly dreams his life away in womanly inactivity. As we saw in Bale, then, Richardson's own horror in the face of pantheism amounts to a revulsion at blurred distinctions and crossed boundaries of East and West, passivity and activity, femininity and masculinity, darkness and light. Almost too perfectly, Richardson concludes his treatise by lambasting the plan to expand the Parisian Pantheon's collection to the Eastern world, turning it thereby into a pantheistic temple. He shudders to imagine its pristine halls crowded with such horrors as the Brahmin cow, the Persian griffin, and the Chaldean sphinx, all monstrous mixtures of divinity and animality. Accelerating what he calls the spreading evil of pantheism, such a beastly temple would invite an ungodly swarm of Eastern chimerical divinities into the anthropomorphic heart of Christian Europe. At the other end of the same Orientalist scale, we find British philosopher Constant Plumpter's initially anonymous general sketch of the history of pantheism, which celebrates precisely the pantheist consummation of Christianity that Richardson fears. Seeking a fully rational, fully European religion, Plumptre disavows any connection to the barbarous Semites and Greeks and turns instead to what she calls the more refined and cultured East. Relying on Max Muller, she argues that the true ancestors of the European race are the Aryans, authors of the Vedas. And fortuitously, it is in the Vedas that we find for the first time pantheism itself in its full growth and maturity. By means of a highly selective reading of highly selective translations, Plumptre maintains that the Vedas teach oneness and interiority, which she claims are far superior to the multiplicity and externality of the savage Greeks and Jews. Ultimately, Plumptre hopes Europe will recover its true origins in India, so that it can purify its heathenized Christianity into a monistic Aryan pantheism. Now, while this glowing representation of allegedly Eastern pantheists might seem a radical departure from Richardson's anti-pantheism, we find in this text the same Orientalist traits simply transvalued. First of all, Plumptre reserves her praise for the light-skinned monistic Brahmins, ridiculing the primitive polytheism of the darker castes. Second, like Richardson, Plumptre attributes a quiet passivity to the Hindus, who, she insists, may be regarded as a religious, contemplative, and philosophical race far more than an active, warlike, or historical race. And although Plumptre praises these qualities, rather than calling them, say, effeminate, her representation nevertheless serves to reaffirm Western dominance over the East. For, as Richard King has argued, these sorts of depoliticized representations of Indian religion serve to justify British colonial rule by suggesting that the people of India weren't interested in governing, so the British might as well do it for them. As in the anti-pantheist literature, then, Plumptre's fascinated adoption of the East serves to reaffirm the West's superiority over it. If Plumptre mobilizes pantheism in service of the Western tradition, feminist philosopher Grace Jansen has more recently mobilized pantheism against it. Remember that old Aristotelian table of opposites? If you're the product of any even remotely deconstructive discipline, then you're probably bored to tears even looking at this slide. This set of oppressive dualisms has been the target of feminist, post-colonial, decolonial, materialist, queer, and critical race theories for decades. What Jansen began to argue in the late 1990s, however, was that the reason this structure still won't budge is that we haven't yet managed to destroy its root, which is to say, the opposition between God and the world. As she ventures, if pantheism were seriously to be entertained, the whole Western symbolic would be brought into question. Pantheism rejects the split between spirit and matter, light and darkness, and the rest. It thereby also rejects the hierarchies based on those splits. Therefore, Jansen suggests, feminist philosophy of religion ought to be pantheist, as should any discipline that seeks to unearth and dismantle structures of oppression. Understandably, many such disciplines want nothing to do with any sort of theism at all, having had more than enough of the patriarchal guy in the sky. From Jansen's perspective, however, their circumvention of theology ends up leaving God intact as a concept, and the concept of God goes on to valorize the disembodiment, omnipotence, and anthropomorphism that are built into that concept. Throughout her argument, then, Jansen is careful to explain she's not working from a realist stance. Rather, she's working at the level of the symbolic. Jansen's not saying that God is the universe, or that the universe is divine. Rather, she's trying to recode divinity as a concept, whether or not an entity called God exists. In this sense, she suggests, pantheism is a far more radical position than atheism, which ends up reinscribing the concept of the God it doesn't believe in. Because for all their disagreement with theists, atheists agree that if there were a God, he would be, for example, anthropomorphic, masculine, all-powerful, and immaterial. Whether under the regime of theism or atheism, then, the concept of the divine serves to valorize disembodied power and rationality. And of course, the concept of the divine is the most powerful concept we have. For the sake of our threatened planet, in the face of our waning biodiversity, and in solidarity with those living and non-living beings whom the Father aligned continue to master, colonize, denigrate, and destroy, Jansen therefore suggests that feminist philosophers begin deliberately to project a pantheist God, a God who is the universe in all its material multiplicity, in her words. If we took for granted that divinity, that which is most to be respected and valued, means mutuality, bodiliness, diversity, and materiality, then whether or not we believe that such a concept of God was instantiated, the implications for our thought and lives would be incalculable. Such implications notwithstanding, it is striking that there has not been a widespread or even small scale or even single person turn toward pantheism among feminist philosophers or theologians. Rather, pantheism in the West continues to serve as a limit position at best and a nasty name at worst for thinkers of nearly every school and political persuasion. And again, I'm trying to understand why. Part 3. You like this guy? I like this guy. The stated objections to pantheism are numerous and often perplexingly opposed to one another. Pantheists are variously charged with materialism and anti-materialism, irrationality and excessive rationality, fanaticism and coldness, idealism and mechanism. Whatever the author's position may be, the pantheist rhetorically incarnates its extreme opposite. And the thickest complex of conflicting accusations turns on Bayle's first charge against Spinoza. Well, technically the second. The first charge, if you remember, was that he was a Jew. The second, and the one that carries throughout Bayle's essay, is that Spinoza was an atheist. At first, it might seem baffling, even incoherent, to call Spinoza an atheist, as Novalis famously intoned. Spinoza was a God-intoxicated man. Everywhere he looks, Spinoza sees the essence and existence of God. Thus, Goethe similarly reminds us that Spinoza does not have to prove the existence of God. Existence is God. So if Spinoza's God is all things and everywhere, then how can this all God be nothing? How does pantheism become atheism? There are two major lines of thinking that produce this conclusion. The first is theological, and insists that the word God means a disembodied, singular, omnipotent, and personal, specifically fatherly force outside the universe. So the pantheist's material, multiple, non-anthropic God is, from this perspective, simply no God at all. It's just not God. For the theist, to see God everywhere is to see him nowhere. In short, the phrase God or nature is conceptually incoherent. The second line of thinking is more philosophical than theological. With Arthur Schopenhauer, it reasons that calling the world divine does not add anything to the concept of world. A universe that is God is materially and functionally equivalent to a universe without God, so why try to dress it up with divinity? As Nancy Frankenberry explains, by assimilating God to nature, pantheists raise the suspicion that one of the two of them is semantically superfluous. Now, from the foregoing objections, we might think it's clear which term is superfluous, God. After all, the pantheist world is self-sufficient and auto-creative, so it basically ditches divinity. And yet, a slew of other critiques level precisely the opposite charge against pantheism. By swallowing all things into God, they argue, pantheism eliminates not God, but the world. The adjective Hegel uses to describe this Spinozist effect is acosmism. If all agents are effectively God, then God is the only agent, and the cosmos, as such, is gone. It is in this sense that Goethe can go on to say that when others rebuke Spinoza with atheism, I prefer to cherish him as theissimus. If the world itself is divine, then God is all there is. For interlocutors less admiring than Goethe, however, Spinoza's all God wreaks havoc on our moral categories. As Leo Strauss worries, the world as God lacks the autonomy to do anything without God, so pantheism denies human freedom. Conversely, many Christian authors worry that pantheism grants humanity too much freedom, allowing them to do whatever they would like in the absence of a divine overlord and in the presence of an indwelling spirit. Still others worry that pantheism evacuates divine freedom. After all, if God is creation, then God is not free not to create, or for that matter, to act contrary to nature, which the pantheist God, after all, is. In sum, these tortuous and conflicting accusations amount to a remarkably plodding hydraulics. If God is the world, then there is no God. If the world is God, then there is no world. If God acts in humans, then humans can't act. If humans are free, then God is unfree. And once again, we see the theist hang on at all costs to the principle of non-contradiction in the face of the pantheist monster. It simply can't be all these things at once. In all its various guises, then, the anti-pantheist complaint amounts to a charge of what Franz Rosenzweig called Gleichmacherei, or making everything the same. Do you love German? You just smush stuff together and you make making everything the same. God and nature, necessity and freedom, good and evil, pantheism seems to smush it all into one gigantic mess. We can see this charge clearly articulated in the work of systematic theologian Colin Gunton. Reflecting on the manifold ills of pantheism, he writes, "For there to be freedom, there must be space. In terms of a relation between God and the universe, this entails an ontological otherness between God and the world. Atheism and materialism are in effect identical with pantheism, for all of them swallow up the many into the one, and so turn the many into mere functions of the one." Succinctly put, Gunton's argument is that if there is no difference between God and the world, there can be no difference at all. And if there's no difference, then none of the parties involved is sufficiently autonomous to be free. So, Gunton suggests, if in our varied political commitments we'd want to affirm things like freedom, diversity, and multiplicity, then we'd better hang on to the difference between God and creation. Otherwise, everything melts, in the inimitable words of D.H. Lawrence, into the awful pudding of one identity. At this point, however, one might want to ask whether the only available options are a two-column hierarchy on the one hand and an awful pudding of oneness on the other. One might even go so far as to ask whether, when it comes down to it, the theistic two is really so different from the puddingish one. After all, the metaphysical framework that opposes God and world, male and female, colonizer and colonized, etc., does not establish the second as genuinely different from the first, so much as a derivation or bad copy of it. One might think here of Judith Butler's analysis of lesbianism as an alleged imitation of heterosexuality, or of Homi Bhabha's colonial mimicry, which produces colonized subjects as almost the same as Europeans, but not quite. What we see in these cases is that the oppositional logic of classic metaphysics does not really give us two at all. It gives us one, and a kind of sad falling short of that one. From this perspective, we can see against Gunton that the binary scheme underwritten by an extra-cosmic God does not secure the freedom of each of these terms. Rather, it secures the freedom of the historically dominant term at the expense of its subjugated other. And so the real concern over pantheism is not the collapse of some abstract notion of difference. It's rather the collapse of one particularly insistent and damaging way of configuring difference, a configuration that gathers each instance of difference into a static category benevolently overseen by a metaphysical life partner. Speaking of life partners, we've already detected an anxiety over gender and sexuality woven through the 19th century projections of dark Eastern pantheists. In these texts, a feminized passivity marks the dreamlike Indian sage who, in his erotic reverie, attributes divinity even to dark and earth-bound things. In more contemporary repudiations of pantheism, these racialized projections go underground as authors focus more explicitly on the category of gender. The gendered language is so pervasive, in fact, that Jansen attributes the whole horror over pantheism to a fairly straightforward gender panic. As she argues, the fear of pantheism bespeaks a perceived, if unconscious, threat to the masculinist symbolic of the West. Jansen detects such threatened masculinity in the surprisingly recurrent language of pantheism swallowing, consuming, and assimilating all otherwise free beings into some dark abyss, whose racial characteristics Jansen seems both to notice and not notice. As she puts it, from a psychoanalytic perspective, one could speculate about what dread of the mother and the maternal womb lurks just below the surface of this fear of pantheism. What exactly is this abyss, this horror of great undifferentiated darkness into which at all costs we must not be sucked? Jansen is thinking primarily of figures like Hegel, Schelling, and Kierkegaard. But this fear of being pantheistically swallowed by a dark maternal monster can be found even in the lesser-known writings of the 19th century. Reverend Dix, for example, says of pantheism that the whole system is one vast dream, one shapeless sea of gloom and woe, without light, without life, cold, remorseless, devouring, an abyss in which all honest conviction is engulfed, all manly belief buried. By summoning this dark, shapeless, unmanning sea, Dix is calling to mind the waters of Genesis 1, that primordial deep, or tehom, that precedes creation. Now in Genesis, a disembodied male voice speaks over this deep to bring forth light and life and planets and stars. But pantheism eliminates the disembodied creator, so all we have is the abyss that buries manliness alive. And the womb becomes tomb. Revolted, Dix tries to imagine what it would look like if this nasty, shapeless sea were to do the work of creating itself. Here's the story he comes up with. The mass, so indescribable, so incomprehensible, was agitated from within by an equally indescribable and incomprehensible motion. The great belly of blackness and unconscious horror rumbled, as it were, and the abyss, for it seems no better, was in labor and would bring forth. At the risk of pointing out the obvious, Dix's nightmare here is that the world might have come into being in the same manner as, say, cats or donkeys or humans. For millennia, the cosmological triumph of masculinist monotheism has been its insistence that while things in the world emerge from the bodies of mothers, the world itself emerges from a bodiless father. By rejecting an extra-cosmic deity, then, pantheism delivers us back to and out of what Dix characterizes in this passage as a black, maternal, irrational abyss. This sort of racialized gender panic is not limited to the Victorian literature. One finds it in more recent rejections of pantheism as well. For example, evangelical theologian William Lane Craig defends the creator God against pantheism with the following illustration. In marriage, the antithesis of two persons is aufgehoben. Do you know this word? It means that the difference is both overcome into something else, and also the difference is preserved at the same time. One never hears this word bizarrely in marriage ceremonies. I've now pronounced you aufgehoben. Not a sexy word. It's a Hegel term. Okay. The antithesis of two persons. Can you imagine Hegel getting married? Oh. Okay. The antithesis of two persons is aufgehoben, as husband and wife come together in a deep unity, even as their distinctness as persons is preserved. In the same way, the opposition between infinite and finite, God and world, is aufgehoben, in that God is intimately related to the world in various ways, even as the ontological distinctness between God and the world is preserved. So we're back once again to the table of opposites. The difference between God and world is analogous to the difference between man and woman. As usual, the man is aligned with infinity and God, while the woman, in pink here, is stuck with finitude and world. As Craig explains, in case we've missed it, God embraces his creature just as a husband embraces his wife. So we'd better hang on to that ontological distinction, otherwise anyone might embrace anyone else, and who knows what monstrous horrors might emerge. We find such raging fear throughout D.H. Lawrence's often hilarious diatribe against Walt Whitman. I am everything, and everything is me, and so we're all one in one identity, quips Lawrence in a Seussical sing-song. He's thinking here of Whitman's ecstatic enfolding of all creatures, his infinite self encompassing atoms and bicycles and choruses and steam trains, workers in America and quadrupeds and birds, and Lawrence simply can't stand it. All that fake exuberance, all those lists of things boiled in one pudding cloth. No, I don't want all those things inside me, thank you. And there's our gender panic. Even for the notoriously lascivious Lawrence, Whitman has made himself too porous, too penetrable, too queer, a pipe open at both ends so everything runs through. Men and women and Brooklyn and bees, Whitman's pantheism makes him the feminine recipient of all of them, including Lawrence bristles, and here comes the race beneath the gender, quote, "an Eskimo in a kayak, little and yellow and greasy," unquote. At the same time as it is universally invaded, Whitman's soul is also infinitely dispersed, promiscuously scattered, Lawrence shudders, into, quote, "the dark limbs of Negroes, the vagina of the prostitute," unquote. Now, Lawrence's revulsion at Whitman's pantheism is clearly not the product of some commitment to theological orthodoxy, nor does it stem from an adherence to self-proclaimed philosophical rigor, rather, his revulsion at Whitman's pantheism is prompted by the bodily intermingling it polyamorously enacts. Whitman is a monster, mixing activity and passivity, creation and reception, and race, sex, gender, and class into what Lawrence calls an enormous one, but which frankly looks more like an unruly multitude. Recalling then the temptations and seductions decried in anti-pantheist treatises, it seems that wherever one stands, pantheism is not only absurd, but also dark, feminized, and dangerously enticing. What Bale, Melville, Richardson, and Dix all call the monstrosity of pantheism, the thing that inspires such panic, amounts to a complicated hybridity of divinity, femininity, darkness, materiality, animality, and sex, undesirable, which is also to say all too desirable, to theists and atheists alike. Building on Janssen's analysis, I would therefore suggest that the matter with pantheism is that it threatens the Western symbolic not just with a maternal abyss, but with a racialized and speciated range of queer monstrosities, with parts combined that ought to be kept separate and boundaries crossed that ought to be maintained. Of course, it all depends on what you mean by pantheism. Part 4. I mentioned toward the beginning of this lecture that definitions of pantheism vary rather dramatically from one another. Etymologically, the term means all God, but what does anybody mean by all? The Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines pantheism as the two-pronged assertion that everything that exists constitutes a unity, and that this all-inclusive unity is divine. By contrast, the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines pantheism as the view that deity and cosmos are identical. These, I'd like to point out, are wildly different definitions, and they tend toward wildly different ontologies. The first definition, if you see, hinges the pantheist position on unity, whereas the second hinges it on immanence. The first says that everything is one, whereas the second says that God is the material world. Now, these aren't opposite claims, they're just really different things to say. And because they're not opposed to one another, it would certainly be possible to affirm both of them at once. One could say, for example, that the deity is the unity or sum of the physical cosmos. That way we would have unity and immanence at the same time. But it's also possible to affirm the first definition while rejecting the second, locating the unity of all things in some essential spiritual or otherworldly realm. Conversely, one could affirm the second while rejecting the first by claiming that the cosmos is divine, but it is not, in fact, a unity. Ultimately, the difference seems to boil down to an etymological duplicity in theism's pan. Does all mean the all? Or does it mean all things? Is pantheism's cosmic divinity one, or is it many? These two different meanings of pan map onto a rarely discussed distinction that William James makes between monistic and pluralistic pantheisms. For the monist, James explains, the world is one tremendous unity in which everything is present to everything else in one vast, co-implicated completeness. For the pluralist, by contrast, the things of this world are in some respects connected, in other respects independent, not members of one all-inclusive individual fact. Monism tells us that everything is connected to everything else, whereas pluralism affirms that connections come and go. Monism is the philosophy of the absolute, of idealism, Germans, and what James called the all form, while pluralism opts for empiricism, it's more British, and the each form, thinking that there may never be an all form at all. Now, of course, James is a pragmatist, so he knows he can't say which of these visions is ultimately true, or even if it makes sense to speak that way. But James sides with pluralism for a host of ethical, political, and psychological reasons. If we insist that everything in existence is one, he reasons, then we're left asking why some parts of this unity so often step out of line with it. We then demonize differences as evil, or we decide to overlook particularities so that we can focus on the abstract whole. But if we affirm a messy plurality rather than a perfect totality, then differences are signs of health rather than pathology. Evil calls for a practical response rather than a speculative explanation, and our everyday particular experiences of coffee and body and art amount to intimacy with the universe itself. For these reasons, James opts for pluralism, which makes of the universe what he calls a multiverse, a loosely coherent, evolving chain of complex connections that's never quite all in all. Here's the way he explains it, and note how he slips into German to make fun of the position he's not asserting. The type of pluralist union, it is true, is different here from the monistic type of All-Einheit. It is not a universal co-implication or integration of all things durcheinander. It is what I call the strung-along type, the type of continuity, contiguity, or concatenation. Unlike almost any other self-professed philosopher then, William James actually professes a pantheist position. And unlike almost all other positions accused of pantheism, this pantheism doesn't make all things one, nor does it capitulate to the theistic two. Rather, a Jamesian pantheism would manage to count higher than two, higher even than the Trinitarian three, and locate divinity in the endless multiplicity of the material world itself. Unfortunately, James does not go on to say what such a pluralist pantheism might look like. My sense is that his strung-along concatenation would constitute a more metaphysically disruptive and therefore more ethically promising pantheism than the monistic totality would, putting not only materiality, but multiplicity at the heart of the concept of divinity. But that is a matter for another afternoon. Thanks.
Ask you to use the microphone when you're asking. Me? Yeah. And speak only into the microphone.
Hi.
Hello. Are you familiar with Hebrew texts, Jewish texts?
Which ones in particular?
Genesis?
Yeah.
Tanakh, yeah.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with the Tav, the female divine?
Mm-hmm. So, well, where in Genesis are you locating that?
Genesis 1:1. The Tav is present in the Hebrew script. The Aleph and the Tav is the male and the female. Mm-hmm. Consciousness originally split itself into the genders male and female. So the Aleph and Tav are the first two things. Mm-hmm. These became animated into human form as the Messiah and his bride, the Migdal, the Magdalene. So it's all within the story. It's just sort of been hidden, but
right. These are interpretations of the text. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah. And tell me what you're looking for.
Well, the story is about these two reuniting and basically balancing out the cosmos. That's the wedding, the divine feminine, the Tav. The Tav mm-hmm. represents the divine feminine, who becomes animated into an actual human being. Yeah, this is fascinating. And there are feminine principles certainly in the rabbinic literature and certainly in mystical literature and Kabbalistic literature that are more forceful certainly than in the strict text of Genesis, for example. And these become, they surface and they go back underground as the centuries go on. This is a fascinating story. It's just, I'm not sure what it has to do with pantheism, but there's gender craziness sort of all over the Bible and rabbinic tradition. Your point or your main aggravation is that most of these are based on a patriarchal male hierarchy.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah. I'm not demonizing an entire sort of genre of literature or anything like that, right? What I'm trying to argue is that I'm sort of beginning just from this particular term, this term pantheism, and trying to figure out why people are so upset about it. And the people who tend to be upset about it are actually not biblical scholars. They're philosophers who call themselves theists. And what they believe in is a disembodied male, like single omnipotent dude who got sort of coded from Platonic philosophy. But there are all kinds of ways of reading, say, scripture, or the parascriptural materials, or rabbinic materials, that would unsettle this theistic picture of the universe. So this is basically a debate within philosophy that I'm trying to hook into here.
Yeah, I mean, it's also within the religious context, too. What I'm saying is, specifically within the Hebrew text and the Christian text, the divine feminine is present, and that's what the story is actually about. Some of these models are the woman is somehow evil or not on the same level or bad, and that's quite contrary to the actual truth of the creation. So.
Here again, you can always go back to texts to find more interesting interpretations than what the sort of dominant tradition gives us. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think you get something much more interesting in Genesis 1 than usual creation theology. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really great talk. Really, really interesting. I mean, I enjoyed it, I should say. So I'm wondering about choosing between pluralistic pantheism and something that isn't really specifically theistic at all, like maybe a pluralism or what some people are calling, new materialism or some kind of materialism. And if you don't feel like it'd be inappropriate for this audience, I'm wondering also where you think a view like Bruno Latour's would fit in this, because I'm sort of guessing that he might be hesitant to take a pantheist view, except maybe for some rhetorical purposes in dialogue maybe with theists or atheists, because it affiliates that God node of the networks with all other nodes, sort of at the outset. And sort of ascribes that divinity status to all of them, whereas we'd want to be able to think about ways in which these things can be more or less connected with the divine.
Right, and once you turn on the God machine, it's hard to turn it off. Yeah, that's great. So it's a two-part question. The first part about the sort of pluralisms emerging in new materialisms and even object-oriented ontologies in sort of across the theoretical spectrum these days, even in animal studies, ecofeminisms, new ones. I actually think what we're seeing there is the kind of subtle emergence of something like a pluralist pantheism. In nonlinear biologies, for example, that are being taken up quite energetically in the new materialisms, we see these interactive creative forces that aren't just one creator, right, but that generate new creative forces that combine in certain ways and that decombine in other ways. Symbiogenesis, for example, is a beautiful example of this. Yeah, if anything like a pluralist pantheism has taken shape anywhere, I think it's taking shape in this new literature, which actually is straddling the distinction between the humanities and the sciences in a really interesting way. That having been said, the question will always be, but like, what does calling that, Haraway's hybridity, for example, what does calling that divine add to the concept of that hybridity? Can you just call it pluralism and hybridity, or do you have to sort of dress it up by calling it divine? I'm not sure. Some people would argue that actually it's important, like Jansen, to do that work of recoding the concept of divinity. Other people are still going to say, let's just leave it alone and not talk about it. But I think that Jansen makes a compelling point, which is that if you leave the God concept to people who define God as male and disembodied, then they've got the biggest rhetorical, I don't want to use weapons language, but they've got the sort of biggest rhetorical force on their side from the outset, right? So you may as well mess with the term and try to see divinity in the sort of complexly emergent material universe itself. As for Latour, he's really fascinating because it's Latour who argues on the one hand, his stunning insight about the sciences, right, is that the sciences all, I don't know, Marcelo, if you work with Latour at all, but that the sciences all keep saying, we're heading for the one, we're getting to one theory, one complete theory, one total theory. And they're saying this at the same time that they're branching off more and more into more and more diversity. He's like, they're doing exactly the opposite of what they're saying. As Marcelo says often, sometimes scientists aren't like the best philosophers, right? So what they're actually doing is producing proliferations of practices and of discourses and of ways of being and doing, and then they're saying, we're one, we're all unifying. So there's that with Latour. But then when he actually begins to talk about what looks like a kind of creeping pantheism in his more recent work, he wants to go for a really singular divine character. Have you heard, he calls it Owab, out of which we are all born. O-W-W-A-A-B, right? And he's like, we are the people of Owab. Oh, people of Owab, let's, right? So theologically, he still has this real attachment to oneness, which is really astonishing for somebody who's, as you were saying, who's so attuned to the comings and goings of different connections. So I would love for Latour's theology to be a little closer to his network theory, but at the moment, anyway, it's the Gifford lectures where he starts talking about Owab. It's pretty cool. Thank you.